The carriage wheel cracked against a stone, and Clara Bennett gripped the seat as the whole cabin shook. Outside, the sky over Ravenshallow had turned the color of a bruise, and somewhere far off, a bell was ringing in a way that did not sound like a welcome. "You do not have to marry him," her mother said suddenly, breaking the silence that had sat between them for the last 2 hours. "Even now, Clara, we can turn this carriage around." Clara did not answer right away. She looked out the small window at the passing hills, at the black iron fence that had just come into view, stretching farther than she could see in either direction. "We cannot turn around, Mother," she said quietly. "You know that as well as I do." Her mother, Margaret, pressed her lips together and looked down at her gloved hands. The Bennett family had once been comfortable, even respected, in the trading town of Ashcombe. Her father, Henry Bennett, had built a modest fortune importing silk and spice, enough to give his daughter a good name and a good education. But 2 bad seasons and 1 dishonest partner had taken almost everything. What remained was a house full of debts and a daughter of marrying age. When the offer came from the Duke of Ravenshallow, nobody in Ashcombe could quite believe it. A duke offering marriage to a merchant's daughter, with no dowry demanded and no explanation given. The whispers began before the ink was even dry on the letter. He buried his first wife within a year of their wedding, the baker's wife had said at the market, not lowering her voice at all. Nobody knows how. Nobody ever saw her again after the wedding, and then one day, she was simply gone. They say, he does not raise his voice, not once, not ever. An old servant who had once worked at Ravenshallow told Clara directly, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "That is the worst kind of cruelty, my dear. A cold man who never shows you what he is thinking until it is too late." Clara had heard a dozen versions of the same warning in the weeks leading up to her departure. The Duke was said to be short-tempered behind closed doors. The Duke was said to have thrown a servant out into the snow for arriving late with his breakfast. The Duke was said to keep no friends, host no gatherings, and speak to almost no one apart from the small staff that remained loyal to him, out of fear rather than love. And yet, when Clara had asked her father directly whether he believed these stories, he had only sighed and rubbed his tired eyes. "I do not know what to believe, Clara," he admitted. "I know that the offer came with no conditions attached, and that alone is strange for a man of his station. I know that if you refuse, we lose the last of what we have, and your younger brothers will have no future worth speaking of. I am sorry to place this weight on you. I truly am." Clara had taken her father's hand and told him she understood. She had not told him about the fear that sat like a stone in her stomach every night since the engagement letter arrived, nor about the dreams in which she walked through an endless dark hallway searching for a door that was never there. Now, as the carriage rolled through the iron gates of Ravenshallow, that same fear rose in her throat, sharp and immediate. The estate spread out before her like something from an old, unhappy story. Gray stone walls rose 3 floors high, framed by towers on either end, that seemed to watch the approaching carriage like sentries. Ivy climbed one side of the building in dark, tangled ropes, and every window she could see was covered by heavy curtains, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. "It is a beautiful house," her mother said, though her voice wavered on the word beautiful, as if she was trying to convince herself. Clara did not answer. She was staring at a lone figure standing at the top of the front steps, still and straight, hands clasped behind his back. Even from this distance, she could tell it was him. The carriage rolled to a stop, and for a moment, nobody moved. Then the door was opened from the outside by a footman in dark livery, and Clara stepped down onto the gravel drive, her legs unsteady beneath her skirts. The Duke of Ravenshallow did not come down to greet her. He remained at the top of the steps, watching her approach with an expression she could not read at all. He was younger than she had expected, though the stories had never mentioned his age, only his cruelty. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp, and his eyes, when she finally reached the top step and stood before him, were a pale gray that seemed to hold no warmth and no coldness either, only a careful, guarded stillness. "Miss Bennett," he said. His voice was low, even, controlled. "You have had a long journey. I hope the roads were not too difficult." "They were manageable, Your Grace," Clara answered, dropping into a careful curtsy, the way she had practiced 100 times before leaving Ashcombe. He inclined his head slightly, and for one strange moment, Clara thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that looked almost like relief, but it vanished so quickly that she was certain she had imagined it. "Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your rooms," he said, gesturing toward an older woman who had appeared silently in the doorway behind him. "You will want to rest before dinner. We will speak more this evening." And with that, he turned and disappeared back into the house, leaving Clara standing on the steps with her mother, both of them staring after him in confused silence. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, was a small woman, with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back so tightly, it looked as though it pained her. She led Clara and her mother through the entrance hall, which was even darker inside than the exterior had suggested, lit only by a few flickering candles despite the hour. "You must forgive the house for feeling cold, miss," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice carrying an odd note of apology. "It has been quiet here for some time. Not many guests come to Ravenshallow these days."
Why is that?
Clara asked, unable to stop herself. Mrs. Pemberton paused at the base of a wide staircase, her hand resting on the banister. She seemed to consider her words carefully before answering. "The Duke prefers quiet, miss. That is all I will say on the matter." Her eyes lingered on Clara for a moment longer than necessary, and then she continued up the stairs without another word. That night, Clara sat alone in her new bedroom, a large space with a high ceiling and a fireplace that had been lit against the evening chill. Her trunks had been brought up and unpacked by a young maid named Grace, who had been friendly enough, but had gone quiet the moment Clara asked about the Duke's temperament. "He is not an easy man to know, miss," Grace had said carefully, folding a dress into the wardrobe with more attention than the task required. "But I have never seen him cruel. Strange, yes. Distant, certainly, but not cruel. Not that I have witnessed." It was not the reassurance Clara had hoped for, but it was something, a small crack in the wall of warnings that had followed her all the way from Ashcombe. Dinner that evening was a quiet, formal affair, held in a dining room far too large for only 2 people. The Duke sat at the head of the table, Clara at his right hand, and between them stretched a silence so complete that Clara could hear every scrape of silverware against porcelain. "You are frightened," the Duke said suddenly, without looking up from his plate. Clara's hand paused halfway to her glass. "I am cautious, Your Grace. There is a difference." For the first time since her arrival, something like the shadow of a smile crossed his face, though it disappeared almost as quickly as it had come. "A careful answer. I imagine you have heard many stories about me before coming here." Clara considered lying, considered offering some polite denial, but something in his steady gaze made her choose honesty instead. "I have heard many stories, yes. And do you believe them?" "I do not know yet," she said. "I have only just arrived." The Duke studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face as though looking for something specific. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and returned his attention to his meal. "Wise," he said quietly. "It is wiser than most who come to this house." Clara wanted to ask what he meant by that, wanted to ask about the first wife, whose name nobody would speak, wanted to ask why the curtains stayed drawn in the middle of the day, and why the staff moved through the halls as if trying not to be noticed. But something told her the answers would not come easily, and certainly not on her first night in this house of shadows. Instead, she finished her meal in silence, aware the entire time of the Duke's presence beside her, a presence that felt less like the monster of the stories, and more like a man carrying something heavy, that he had no intention of setting down in front of a stranger. Later that night, alone again in her room, Clara stood at the window and looked out over the dark grounds of Ravenshallow. Somewhere out there, beyond the gardens and the tree line, was the world she had left behind, the small, comfortable life in Ashcombe that no longer belonged to her. Ahead of her was a wedding in 3 days' time, a marriage to a man the whole country seemed to fear, and a house that held its secrets as tightly as the ivy held the stone. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and made herself a quiet promise. Whatever waited for her in the coming days, whatever truth lay behind the whispers and the warnings, she would not let herself be afraid without first knowing the reason why. Behind her, the fire cracked and settled in the grate, and somewhere down the long dark hallway outside her door, she heard the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps pausing directly outside, lingering there for a moment before finally moving on. Clara did not sleep well that first night. She lay awake long after the candles had burned low, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling around her, the wind pressing against the old windows, and somewhere far below, what she thought might have been a door opening and closing with great care, as though someone did not wish to be heard. By morning, the fear that had gripped her the day before had settled into something quieter, something more watchful. She rose early, dressed with Grace's help, and made her way down to the breakfast room, determined to learn more about the man she was set to marry, before the wedding took away her chance to ask questions freely. She found the Duke already seated, a cup of tea untouched before him, staring at nothing in particular. He looked up when she entered, and for a brief moment, before his expression settled back into its usual careful neutrality, she saw something raw and unguarded in his face, something that looked very much like exhaustion. "You did not sleep either," she said, before she could stop herself. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Is it so obvious?" "You have the look of a man who has spent the night with his thoughts rather than his dreams," Clara said, taking the seat across from him. "I know the look well. I have worn it myself since your letter arrived." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect. "You are more direct than I expected, Miss Bennet." "I have found that directness saves a great deal of time," she replied, "and I suspect neither of us has much patience left for polite pretending." The Duke was quiet for a moment, turning his teacup slowly on its saucer. "No," he said finally, "I suppose we do not." It was not much, not nearly enough to answer the 100 questions crowding Clara's mind, but it was a beginning, a small crack of honesty in the wall of silence that surrounded this house and the man who ruled it. And as she sat there in the pale morning light, watching him carefully across the table, Clara began to understand that whatever waited for her at Ravenshallow, it was far more complicated than the simple cruelty the stories had promised. The second day at Ravenshallow began with a knock that Clara had not expected. Grace entered carrying a folded note, her face carefully blank in a way that told Clara the maid already knew what it contained. "His Grace asks if you would care to walk the grounds with him this morning, miss," Grace said. "He says there is no obligation, only an offer." Clara read the short note twice, searching the careful handwriting for some hidden meaning, though there was none to find. It was simply an invitation, plain and direct, much like the man who had written it. She dressed quickly, and found him waiting near the eastern doors, dressed for the outdoors, his expression unreadable as always. When she approached, he offered a small nod rather than a greeting, as though words were a currency he spent only when necessary. They walked in silence for the first few minutes, following a gravel path that wound between tall hedges, shaped into careful, geometric rows. Clara noticed the garden was well kept, more carefully tended than she would have expected from a house that seemed to have given up on visitors. "You maintain the gardens even though no one comes to see them," she observed. "My mother loved this garden," the Duke said. "She planted the roses near the fountain herself, many years ago. I keep it as she left it." It was the first personal thing he had told her, the first glimpse into a life that existed before the rumors, before the cold reputation that clung to him like a shadow. Clara felt something loosen slightly in her chest. "Is she still living, your mother?" "No," he said simply, and something in his tone closed the subject as firmly as a door. Clara did not press further, though she filed the moment away carefully, another small piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to assemble. They continued walking, past a stone fountain gone quiet and dry, past a row of old oak trees that must have stood for 100 years or more. Clara found herself watching him, rather than the scenery, noting the careful way he moved, the stillness in his shoulders, as though he had trained himself long ago never to appear unsettled. "You are studying me," he said suddenly, without turning his head. "I am trying to understand you," Clara admitted. "The stories I have heard do not match the man walking beside me." "Perhaps the stories are wrong," he said, "or perhaps you have simply not yet seen enough of me to know which parts are true." There was something almost like a challenge in his words, and Clara felt a small thrill of determination rise within her. She had never been one to back away from a puzzle, and this man, with his careful silences and his guarded eyes, was the greatest puzzle she had ever encountered. They came to a section of the garden Clara had not seen before, a smaller courtyard tucked behind a wall of climbing ivy, containing a single stone bench beneath a young cherry tree. The tree was clearly newer than the rest of the garden, its bark still smooth, its branches slender. The Duke stopped walking the moment they entered the courtyard, and something in his posture changed, a stiffness settling over him that had not been there a moment before. "This tree," Clara said carefully, sensing she had stumbled onto something significant. "It looks newly planted." "It was planted 3 years ago," he said, his voice suddenly distant. "It is not important. Come, there is more of the grounds to see before the day grows too warm." But Clara had already seen enough. 3 years, she thought. That was around the time, according to the whispers she had heard in Ashcombe, that his first wife had disappeared from the household entirely. She said nothing more on the subject, but the image of that small, solitary tree stayed with her for the rest of the walk, a quiet marker of something the Duke clearly did not wish to discuss. Later that afternoon, while the Duke was occupied with estate matters in his study, Clara took the opportunity to explore the house on her own, guided loosely by Grace, who seemed to have appointed herself as an unofficial companion during Clara's stay. "What happened to her?" Clara asked quietly as they walked past a long hallway lined with portraits. "The first wife. Everyone speaks of her disappearance, but no one will say what truly happened." Grace's steps slowed, and she glanced around as though checking for anyone who might overhear. "It is not my place to speak of it, miss, truly." "Please," Clara said. "I am to marry this man in 2 days' time. I think I deserve to know what I am marrying into." Grace hesitated, chewing her lower lip, clearly torn between loyalty and sympathy. Finally, she sighed. "Lady Vivian was a kind woman, miss. Gentle, quiet, much like yourself in some ways. She and the Duke were happy, or so it seemed to those of us who served them. Then, one winter, she fell ill. A fever that would not break, no matter what the physicians tried. She passed before the spring came." Clara stopped walking entirely, staring at Grace in the dim hallway light. "She died?" The stories in Ashcombe made it sound as though she vanished, as though the Duke had done something terrible. "People love a dark story more than a sad one, miss," Grace said quietly. "A grieving widower is easy to pity, but a Duke who is cold and silent, who shuts himself away and will not speak of his loss, that is easy to fear instead. And fear travels faster than truth, especially when it is fed by those who benefit from it." "Who would benefit from such stories?" Clara asked. Grace's expression flickered with something like caution. "There are those in the family who stood closer to the title before his Grace's father passed it to him. I say no more than that, miss. It is not my place." Clara wanted to press further, wanted to demand a name, but she could see that Grace had already said more than she felt comfortable saying, and pushing harder would only close the door that had just barely opened. That evening, dinner was quieter than the night before, though something in the air between them had shifted subtly. Clara found herself watching the Duke with new eyes, no longer searching for signs of cruelty, but instead, searching for signs of grief, carefully hidden beneath layers of control. "You planted a cherry tree for her," Clara said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that she could no longer contain the thought. The Duke's hand stilled on his glass. He did not look up immediately, and when he finally did, his eyes held something raw and unguarded, the same look she had glimpsed that morning at breakfast. "Grace should not have spoken of such things," he said, though there was no anger in his voice, only a tired resignation. "She did not tell me everything," Clara said gently, "only enough to make me understand that perhaps the stories I heard before coming here were not entirely fair to you." The Duke set down his glass carefully, as though the simple motion required great concentration. "The stories are convenient for people who wish to believe the worst of me. It is easier to imagine a monster in this house than to imagine a man who failed to save the person he loved most, despite every physician, every remedy, every prayer he offered." "You did not fail her," Clara said softly. "Illness is not a failure of the heart, Your Grace." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, in a way he had not before, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The candlelight flickered between them, and Clara felt something pass through the silence, an understanding neither of them had expected to find this quickly. "You are the first person outside these walls who has spoken to me of Vivian, without either pity or suspicion," he said finally. "I did not expect that from a stranger arriving under such strange circumstances." "Perhaps we are not entirely strangers anymore," Clara said. "Not after today. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since her arrival at Ravenshallow, he offered her a smile, small and brief, but entirely genuine. Perhaps not, he agreed quietly. Later that night, as Clara prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not of the cold and cruel Duke the whole country whispered about, but of a grieving man tending a garden his mother had planted, and a tree he had grown in memory of a wife he had lost too soon. The wedding was now only a day away, and for the first time since receiving that unexpected letter in Ashcombe, Clara felt something other than fear settle into her chest. She felt curiosity, and beneath it, something warmer still, something she was not yet ready to name. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky so clear and blue that it seemed to mock the heavy mood that had settled over Ravenshallow for days. Clara stood in front of the tall mirror in her room, while Grace fastened the last of the small pearl buttons along the back of her gown, her fingers quick and practiced. "You look beautiful, miss," Grace said softly. "Truly, you do." Clara studied her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at her. The dress was pale ivory, simple but elegant, chosen weeks ago, in Ashcombe, before she had ever seen the man she would marry. She had imagined, back then, that she would feel only dread on this morning. Instead, she felt something far more complicated, a knot of nerves tangled together with something that almost resembled hope. Her mother arrived a few minutes later, her eyes already glistening with tears she was trying hard to hide. "You look just like your grandmother did on her wedding day," Margaret said, taking Clara's hands in her own. "She would have been proud to see you standing here." "Do you still worry for me?" Clara asked quietly. Her mother hesitated. "I worried a great deal when we arrived, Clara. I will admit that freely, but I have watched you these past 2 days, and I have seen the way you look when you speak of him now. It is not the look of a woman walking toward danger." Clara squeezed her mother's hands gratefully, though she said nothing more. There was still so much she did not know about the man she was about to marry, so many questions left unanswered, so many shadows still lingering in the corners of this great house. But there was also the memory of a cherry tree grown from grief, and a rare, genuine smile shared over a quiet dinner. And these things had begun to matter more than any rumor whispered in a market square. The ceremony was held in the estate's private chapel, a small stone building tucked behind the main house, its windows filled with old colored glass that scattered soft light across the narrow aisle. Only a handful of guests had been invited, mostly staff and a few distant relatives, whose curiosity had clearly outweighed their caution. Clara noticed one guest in particular as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, a tall, sharp-featured man standing near the back, watching the proceedings, with an expression that did not match the solemn occasion. There was something almost hungry in the way he observed the room, his eyes moving quickly between Clara, the Duke, and the small gathering of witnesses, as though he were cataloging every detail for some later purpose. She did not have time to dwell on the stranger, however, because her attention was quickly pulled forward, toward the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle. The Duke stood tall and composed, dressed in dark formal clothing that made his pale gray eyes seem even more striking against the muted colors of the chapel. When Clara's gaze met his, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of everything that had happened over the past 2 days. The careful walks, the honest conversations, the fragile trust that had begun to grow where fear once stood. The ceremony itself passed quickly, the vows spoken in clear, steady voices, the exchange of rings simple and unadorned. When the moment came for the Duke to lift the thin veil from Clara's face, his hands were gentle, almost hesitant, as though he feared that even this small gesture might somehow break the fragile peace they had built. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant said, and for a brief moment, the Duke's composure wavered, something uncertain flickering across his features, before he leaned forward and pressed a light, careful kiss to Clara's lips. It was over quickly, formal and restrained, but Clara felt the warmth of it long after they had turned to face the small gathering of witnesses, now officially husband and wife. The reception that followed was modest by the standards of the nobility, held in the estate's grand hall, decorated simply with white flowers and soft candlelight. Clara moved through the gathering at her husband's side, accepting quiet congratulations from the staff, who had clearly grown fond of her over her short stay, and polite, if somewhat stiff, greetings from the handful of relatives who had bothered to attend. It was during this reception that Clara found herself briefly alone with the sharp-featured stranger she had noticed earlier in the chapel. He approached her near the refreshment table, his smile pleasant enough on the surface, though something about it did not quite reach his eyes. "Edmund Ashford," he introduced himself, offering a slight bow. "Cousin to the Duke, and I must say, a very curious spectator to this whole affair." "Curious, sir?" Clara asked carefully. "Forgive me," Edmund said, his smile widening slightly. "It is simply unusual, is it not, for a man of my cousin's reputation to marry again so soon, and to a bride of such modest background. I only wonder what convinced him to make such a choice." Clara felt a flicker of unease at his words, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Perhaps he simply found someone he wished to spend his life with, Mr. Ashford. It need not be more complicated than that." Edmund's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, calculating and cold. "Of course. Forgive my curiosity. I only hope, for your sake, that you know the full history of this family before settling too comfortably into it." Before Clara could respond, the Duke appeared at her side, his hand settling protectively at the small of her back. "Edmund," he said, his voice carrying a coolness Clara had not heard from him before. "I did not expect you to travel so far for the ceremony." "I would not have missed it for the world, cousin," Edmund replied smoothly. "Congratulations to you both. I do hope this marriage brings you the peace the last one did not." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, and Clara felt the Duke's hand tighten slightly against her back. For a moment, the careful composure he had maintained throughout the day threatened to crack entirely, his jaw tightening, his eyes flashing with something that looked dangerously close to anger. "Thank you for your good wishes," the Duke said finally, his voice tight but controlled. "I am certain you have a long journey home ahead of you." It was a clear dismissal, and Edmund, after a moment of consideration, offered another shallow bow, before turning and melting back into the crowd of guests. Clara watched him go, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach that she could not quite explain. "Who is he, truly?" she asked quietly, once Edmund had disappeared from sight. "My father's brother's son," the Duke said, his voice tight. "He stood only a few names away from inheriting Ravenshallow, before my father's will made his intentions clear. Edmund has never quite forgiven the family for that decision." "He mentioned your first marriage," Clara said carefully, in a way that felt deliberately unkind. The Duke was quiet for a moment, his eyes following the direction Edmund had disappeared. "Edmund has a gift for finding the exact words that will cause the most damage while appearing, on the surface, entirely innocent. I would advise you to be cautious around him, should your paths cross again." Clara nodded, filing away this new piece of information, alongside everything else she had learned since arriving at Ravenshallow. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture, though the full shape of it remained just out of reach. The rest of the reception passed without further incident, though Clara found herself watching the crowd more carefully after her conversation with Edmund, noting which relatives lingered near him, which servants seemed to avoid his gaze entirely. By the time the last guests had departed, and the candles had begun to burn low, Clara felt exhausted in a way that had little to do with the long day, and everything to do with the weight of unspoken questions pressing against her mind. As the evening drew to a close, and the staff began quietly clearing away the remains of the celebration, the Duke turned to Clara with an expression she had not seen on him before, something almost like nervousness flickering behind his careful composure. "It has been a long day," he said quietly. "Are you ready to retire?" Clara felt her heart quicken at the question, aware of everything it implied, aware that whatever waited for her beyond this evening would mark the true beginning of her life as Duchess of Ravenshallow. She thought of Edmund's cold smile, of the small cherry tree in the hidden courtyard, of every warning she had carried with her from Ashcombe, and every quiet moment of honesty that had slowly begun to replace them. "Yes," she said finally, meeting her husband's eyes steadily. "I am ready." The door to the ducal chambers closed with a soft click, and for a long moment, neither Clara nor her new husband moved. The room was lit by a low fire and a handful of candles, casting long shadows across the heavy furniture and the tall windows draped in dark velvet curtains. Clara stood near the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs, acutely aware of the silence stretching between them. The Duke remained near the door, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You have had a long day," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "You must be tired." "I am," Clara admitted, "though I do not think tiredness is the only thing keeping my heart beating so quickly tonight." Something flickered across his face, and he took a small step closer, though he stopped well short of closing the distance between them entirely. "Clara," he said, using her given name for the first time since her arrival. "I would not have you fear this night, or any night that follows it." "I do not think I fear you," Clara said slowly, testing the truth of the words even as she spoke them. "Though I will admit, there is much about you I still do not understand." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and then, quietly, almost hesitantly, he asked the question that would linger in Clara's memory for the rest of her life. "Are you frightened of me?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct, stripped of all the formality and careful distance that had defined their conversations since her arrival. Clara felt the weight of it settle over her, understanding instinctively that this moment mattered more than either of them had perhaps intended. She thought of the whispers that had followed her from Ashcombe, the warnings about his temper, his coldness, the mysterious fate of the wife who had come before her. She thought of the cherry tree grown from grief, the smile shared over dinner, the protective hand that had settled at her back when Edmund's words had turned sharp and unkind. "No," she said finally, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the word was entirely true. "I am not frightened of you. I was frightened of the stories I heard about you, but I do not think those stories were ever truly about the man standing in front of me." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a tension she had not fully realized he was carrying, finally beginning to ease. He crossed the remaining distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, though she did not. "I have carried this reputation for 3 years," he said quietly, once he stood close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. "I have let people believe the worst of me because it was easier than explaining the truth, easier than speaking of Vivian's illness, of the helplessness I felt watching her fade, despite everything I tried to do. It was simpler to let the world believe I had become cold and cruel than to admit how deeply her loss had broken something in me." "You do not seem broken to me," Clara said softly. "Perhaps not entirely," he admitted, "but I have spent 3 years building walls around myself, Clara. Walls I was not certain I would ever be willing to lower again. And then your father's letter arrived, offering an arrangement I had not expected, and I found myself hoping, despite every instinct telling me not to, that perhaps there was still a way forward that did not involve spending the rest of my life alone in this house." "Why me?" Clara asked. "Why choose a merchant's daughter, with no dowry demanded, no explanation given?" The Duke was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "I had heard of your family's circumstances through a mutual acquaintance, and I had heard, too, that you were known for your intelligence and your kindness, qualities that seemed rare enough in the circles I typically moved through. I will admit, it was something of a gamble on my part, choosing to marry a woman I had never met, based on second-hand descriptions and a great deal of hope. But I find, now that you are here, that the gamble was worth taking." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth that had little to do with the fire crackling in the hearth beside them. "I am glad you took the chance," she said quietly, "though I confess I nearly did not come at all. The stories frightened me more than I wanted to admit." "And now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now," Clara said, reaching out to take his hand in hers, "I find myself far more curious about the truth than afraid of the rumors." The Duke's fingers tightened gently around hers, and for the first time since her arrival at Ravenshallow, Clara saw him smile freely, without restraint or hesitation, a smile that transformed his entire face and made him look, for just a moment, like a man entirely free of the weight he had carried for so long. They talked long into the night, sitting together near the fire, Clara learning more about her new husband in those quiet hours than she had learned in all the days leading up to their wedding. He told her about his childhood at Ravenshallow, about the mother who had planted the rose garden, and the father who had taught him to value duty above all else. He told her, carefully and with visible difficulty, about Vivian, about the quiet happiness they had shared before illness took her, and about the guilt that had haunted him ever since. Guilt that whispered he should have found some way to save her, though every physician who attended her had assured him there was nothing more to be done. "I do not think you failed her," Clara said again, more firmly this time. "Grief convinces us of many untrue things, Julian. It is not your fault that illness took her from you." It was the first time she had used his given name, and something in his expression softened further at the sound of it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I do not think anyone has said those words to me so plainly before." As the fire burned low and the candles guttered toward their final light, Clara found herself leaning against her husband's shoulder, exhaustion finally catching up with the emotional weight of the day. The Duke, Julian, wrapped an arm carefully around her, and for a long while, they simply sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who had begun the day as near strangers and ended it as something far more complicated and far more hopeful than either had expected. Before sleep finally claimed her, Clara found herself thinking once more of Edmund Ashford's cold smile at the reception, of his pointed words about the last marriage and the peace it had not brought. Something about his presence at the wedding nagged at her, a small thread of unease she could not quite dismiss, even in the warmth of this new understanding with her husband. But that was a concern for tomorrow. Tonight, for the first time since receiving that unexpected letter in Ashcombe, Clara allowed herself to simply feel safe, wrapped in the quiet warmth of a fire, and a husband who, despite every warning she had carried with her, had turned out to be nothing like the cruel Duke of the stories at all. The weeks that followed, the wedding settled into a quiet rhythm that Clara had not expected to find at Ravenshallow. Mornings began with breakfast together, no longer silent, but filled with easy conversation about the estate, the tenants, the small daily matters of running such a large household. Julian, she discovered, was a far more attentive and thoughtful man than the rumors had ever suggested, patient with the staff, generous with the tenant farmers who depended on the estate for their livelihoods, and quietly devoted to the memory of a mother whose garden he tended himself, refusing to let any hired hand touch the roses she had planted. One morning, as Clara walked through the stable yard on her way to visit the horses, she came upon a scene that further chipped away at the last remnants of the reputation she had carried with her from Ashcombe. A young stable boy, no older than 12, had accidentally allowed one of the carriage horses to bolt from its stall, sending the animal careening across the yard in a panic, before it was finally caught by two older grooms. The boy stood frozen, pale with fear, clearly expecting harsh punishment for his mistake. When Julian arrived, alerted by the commotion, Clara braced herself, remembering the stories of a duke who threw servants out into the snow for the smallest failures. Instead, Julian knelt down to the boy's level, his voice calm and steady. "Are you hurt?" he asked first, before anything else. "No, Your Grace," the boy stammered. "I am sorry. I did not latch the gate properly. I know it was my fault entirely." "Mistakes happen," Julian said simply. "The important thing is that no one was harmed. Show me exactly what happened, so we can make certain the latch is repaired properly, and this does not happen again." The boy's fear visibly melted into relief, and he led Julian to the stall in question, explaining in halting words what had gone wrong. Julian listened patiently, examined the latch himself, and quietly instructed one of the older grooms to have it repaired before the week was out. Clara watched the entire exchange from a distance, feeling something warm settle in her chest. This was not the behavior of a cruel, unforgiving man. This was patience, understanding, a quiet kindness that the rumors from Ashcombe had never once mentioned. Later that same week, Clara accompanied Julian on a visit to one of the tenant farms at the edge of the estate, where a widowed farmer struggled to manage her fields alone after losing her husband to illness the previous winter. Clara watched as Julian spoke with the woman, not with the cold formality of a distant landlord, but with genuine concern, arranging for additional laborers to help with the harvest, and quietly forgiving a portion of the rent that had fallen behind during the difficult months. "You never mentioned you did this," Clara said, as they rode back toward the main house that afternoon. "It is not something I speak of widely," Julian admitted. "My father believed that a duke's true measure was found in how he treated those who depended on him, not in how loudly he announced his own generosity. I have tried to hold to that belief, even when the rest of the world seemed determined to believe the worst of me instead." "Why do you think the rumors persisted so strongly?" Clara asked. "Surely someone among the tenants, the staff, must have spoken of your true character at some point." Julian was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I have wondered that myself, more than once. It seems almost too convenient, the way the stories grew louder and more exaggerated in the years following Vivian's passing, precisely when Edmund began making more frequent appearances at family gatherings and in certain social circles where such stories might easily spread. Clara felt a chill at the mention of Edmund's name, remembering the cold calculation she had glimpsed behind his polite smile at the wedding reception. You suspect he has been spreading these rumors deliberately? I have no proof, Julian admitted, but I have long suspected that Edmund resents the inheritance that passed to me rather than to him, and I would not put it past him to use whatever means available to damage my reputation, particularly if it served some larger purpose of his own. What purpose could rumors serve him if the title has already been settled? Julian's expression darkened slightly. That, Clara, is a question I have asked myself many times, without finding a satisfactory answer, but I intend to find out, particularly now that he has taken an interest in our marriage. That evening, Clara found herself unable to shake the unease that had settled over her since the conversation with Julian. She decided to seek out Mrs. Pemberton, hoping the housekeeper's long years of service might offer some insight into the mystery surrounding Edmund's motives. She found the older woman in the small sitting room off the kitchen, mending a torn curtain by candlelight. Mrs. Pemberton looked up in surprise as Clara entered, quickly setting aside her work and rising to offer a proper greeting. Please, do not trouble yourself, Clara said, taking a seat across from her. I only wish to speak with you privately, if you have a moment to spare. Of course, Your Grace, Mrs. Pemberton said, settling back into her chair, though her posture remained careful and watchful. I wanted to ask you about Edmund Ashford, Clara said directly, having learned by now that the housekeeper responded better to honesty than to careful evasion. I sense there is more to his history with this family than I have been told. Mrs. Pemberton's expression tightened slightly, and she glanced toward the door before answering, as though checking for unwanted listeners. Mr. Ashford has never accepted the terms of the late Duke's will, Your Grace. He believed, quite strongly, that the title and estate should have passed through his branch of the family, rather than to His Grace's father, and then to His Grace himself. Why did it not? Clara asked. There was some disagreement between the brothers, many years ago now, before either of the current generation was born, Mrs. Pemberton explained. The late Duke's father favored his younger son, His Grace's father, for reasons never fully explained to the staff. Mr. Ashford's branch of the family has resented this decision for 2 generations now, and Mr. Ashford himself has made no secret, at least among those of us who serve this house, of his belief that the title rightfully belongs to him. Do you believe he has been spreading rumors about the Duke, in an effort to damage his standing? Mrs. Pemberton hesitated, her fingers worrying at the edge of the curtain in her lap. I do not know for certain, Your Grace, but I will say this. Shortly after Lady Vivian's passing, when His Grace was at his most vulnerable, I noticed Mr. Ashford visiting the estate with unusual frequency, always finding reasons to speak with the staff, always asking careful questions about His Grace's state of mind, his habits, his moods. It was around that same time that the darker stories began circulating in the surrounding villages, stories that painted a picture of His Grace that I never once witnessed with my own eyes in all my years of service. Clara felt a growing certainty settle over her, a suspicion that Julian's instincts had been correct all along. Someone had deliberately built the reputation that had followed her husband, using his grief and vulnerability as raw material for a campaign of quiet, calculated damage. Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton, Clara said finally. You have been very helpful. If I may say so, Your Grace, Mrs. Pemberton added, her expression softening slightly. It does this old house good to see His Grace smiling again, as he has been since your arrival. Whatever else may be uncertain, that much has been a welcome change. Clara returned to her own chambers that evening with much to consider, the pieces of the puzzle surrounding Edmund's motives beginning to form a clearer, more troubling picture. She found Julian already there, reviewing some estate documents by candlelight, and she settled beside him, sharing what she had learned from Mrs. Pemberton. Julian listened carefully, his expression growing grim as she spoke. It confirms what I have long suspected, he said finally, though I still do not fully understand what Edmund hopes to gain, beyond simple spite, from damaging my reputation so thoroughly. Perhaps we should find out, Clara said. Together. Julian looked at her for a long moment, something like gratitude and affection mixing plainly in his expression. "Together," he agreed quietly. "I find I much prefer facing this particular puzzle with you at my side, rather than carrying it alone, as I have for these past 3 years." Outside, the wind picked up against the old windows of Ravenshallow, and somewhere in the depths of the great house, a door creaked softly, as though the building itself were settling in for whatever storm might be coming. A week after her conversation with Mrs. Pemberton, Clara found herself standing before a locked door on the 3rd floor of the east wing, a door she had passed many times during her explorations of the house, but had never before questioned. Grace, who had accompanied her that afternoon, hesitated visibly when Clara paused before it. "What is behind this door?" Clara asked. Grace glanced around the empty hallway before answering, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "That was Lady Vivian's sitting room, Your Grace." His Grace ordered it locked after her passing, and has never permitted anyone to enter since, not even for cleaning. Clara studied the heavy wooden door, its brass handle slightly tarnished with age and disuse. "Has he never spoken of what remains inside?" "Never, Your Grace. Some of the older staff believe he cannot bear to face it. Others believe he simply wishes to preserve it exactly as she left it, a kind of memorial that no one is permitted to disturb." Clara felt a pang of sympathy for her husband, understanding now more fully the depth of grief he had carried silently for 3 long years. She resolved not to press him about the locked room, respecting the private nature of his mourning, though the mystery of it lingered in her mind as she continued her exploration of the house. That evening, however, an unexpected visitor arrived at Ravenshallow, disrupting the quiet rhythm that had settled over the household in recent weeks. Clara was informed by Mrs. Pemberton that Edmund Ashford had arrived unannounced, requesting an audience with the Duke on a matter he described only as urgent family business. Julian's expression darkened considerably upon receiving the news, and Clara noticed his hands tighten briefly at his sides before he composed himself. "I suppose we should see what business brings my cousin to Ravenshallow without invitation," he said grimly. They received Edmund in the formal drawing room, a space rarely used since Clara's arrival, its heavy curtains drawn back to allow the fading afternoon light to filter through the tall windows. Edmund entered with the same smooth confidence Clara remembered from the wedding, though something about his demeanor today felt sharper, more purposeful, as though he had arrived with a specific goal in mind. "Cousin," Julian said coolly, remaining standing rather than offering a seat. "This is an unexpected visit." "Forgive the lack of notice," Edmund said, though his tone carried little genuine apology. "I have come across some information I felt you would want to know immediately, particularly given your recent marriage." "And what information might that be?" Julian asked, his voice carefully neutral. Edmund's gaze flicked briefly toward Clara, before settling back on Julian, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It has come to my attention that certain creditors in Ashcombe are prepared to make public the full extent of the Bennet family's financial difficulties, including some rather unfortunate details about the circumstances that led to their sudden and considerable debt. I thought you would want the opportunity to address such matters before they became public knowledge, given the potential embarrassment to the Ravenshallow name." Clara felt her stomach twist with unease, though she kept her expression carefully composed, refusing to give Edmund the satisfaction of seeing her rattled by his words. "My wife's family circumstances are not a matter of shame," Julian said firmly. "Nor are they any concern of yours, Edmund. I would ask that you state plainly what you actually want from this visit, rather than dressing up threats as concerned family assistance." Edmund's smile faltered slightly at Julian's directness, though he recovered quickly. "I want nothing more than to see the family name protected, cousin, though I will admit, it does seem rather convenient that you married so quickly into a family with such significant financial troubles. One might almost wonder whether the arrangement served purposes beyond simple affection." "Careful," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that Clara had not heard from him before. "You are speaking of my wife, Edmund, and I will not tolerate insinuations against her character in my own home." For a moment, tension crackled in the air between the two men, and Clara found herself holding her breath, watching the confrontation unfold with growing unease. Edmund, however, seemed to recognize he had pushed as far as he safely could, and he raised his hands slightly in a gesture of surrender. "I meant no offense, cousin. I simply wished to bring the matter to your attention, before it became a wider embarrassment. I will leave you to consider how best to address it." He offered a shallow bow toward Clara. "Your Grace," he said, before turning and departing the room without further ceremony. Once the sound of his footsteps had faded down the hallway, Clara turned to Julian, her composure finally beginning to crack. What did he mean by that? What creditors? What debts? Julian's expression softened as he turned to face her fully. "I do not know the specifics he referenced, Clara, but I suspect Edmund is attempting to manufacture a scandal where none genuinely exists, hoping perhaps to drive a wedge between us, or to damage your standing sufficiently that questions might arise about the legitimacy of our marriage." "Why would he go to such lengths?" Clara asked, her voice tight with growing frustration. "What does he truly hope to gain?" "I intend to find out," Julian said firmly. "I will write to my solicitor immediately and have him investigate both the claims Edmund has made and Edmund's own recent activities. If he has been deliberately spreading falsehoods about our family, whether concerning my reputation or now your own, I intend to put a stop to it entirely." Clara felt a measure of relief at her husband's resolve, though the unease Edmund's visit had stirred did not fully dissipate. That night, unable to sleep despite the late hour, she found herself once again standing before the locked door on the third floor, drawn by an instinct she could not fully explain. She reached out and tried the handle, half expecting it to remain firmly locked as it always had. To her surprise, it turned easily beneath her hand, the door swinging open into a room that had clearly not been touched in years. Dust covered every surface, though the furniture remained carefully arranged, as though its former occupant might return at any moment to resume her place among the faded cushions and half-finished embroidery left abandoned on a small side table. A portrait hung above the modest fireplace, depicting a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Unmistakably, Lady Vivian. Clara stepped further into the room, feeling like an intruder in a space that had been so carefully preserved, so deliberately shut away from the passage of time. Her eyes fell upon a small writing desk near the window, and upon it, a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the room and carefully untying the ribbon, her curiosity overwhelming her sense of propriety. The letters, she quickly realized, were not written by Vivian at all, but addressed to her, and the handwriting on the topmost letter sent a jolt of recognition through Clara's entire body. The elegant, slanted script belonged unmistakably to Edmund Ashford. With trembling hands, Clara began to read, and as she made her way through the first letter, a cold understanding began to settle over her, one that suggested the mystery surrounding this house, this family, and the man she had married ran far deeper and far darker than she had ever imagined. The letters spanned nearly 2 years, Clara realized, as she read through them by the pale light of a single candle she had brought from her own chambers. The earliest ones were carefully polite, almost friendly in tone, Edmund writing to Vivian under the guise of family concern, asking after her health, her happiness, her adjustment to life as Duchess of Ravenshallow. But as Clara continued reading, the tone of the letters shifted gradually, becoming more probing, more insistent. Edmund began asking pointed questions about Julian's moods, his private habits, whether he seemed distracted or troubled by matters of the estate. He spoke often of his own difficult circumstances, painting himself as a wronged man, denied his rightful inheritance, subtly encouraging Vivian's sympathy while planting seeds of doubt about her husband's character. One letter in particular made Clara's blood run cold. Dated only a few months before Vivian's illness had first been noted by the household staff, Edmund had written at length about the supposed instability running through the Ravenshallow bloodline, suggesting, without ever stating it outright, that Julian might one day become a danger to those closest to him, just as his own father had allegedly struggled with similar darkness in his final years. Clara understood immediately what Edmund had been attempting. He had spent years quietly working to isolate Vivian, to fill her mind with doubt and fear about the very man who loved her, likely hoping to drive a wedge into the marriage that he might later exploit for his own purposes. Whether his efforts had contributed directly to the stress and worry that may have weakened Vivian before her fatal illness took hold, Clara could not say for certain, but the timing alone was deeply troubling. The final letter in the collection, dated only weeks before Vivian's death, contained a passage that made Clara's hands shake as she read it. Edmund had written plainly of his intention to ensure that, regardless of what became of the current Duke's marriage, The true rightful line would eventually reclaim what had been unjustly denied to them for 2 generations. Clara carefully retied the ribbon around the letters and made her way back to her own chambers, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. She found Julian still awake, seated near the fire, and the moment he saw her expression, he rose quickly, concern etched across his features. "Clara, what has happened? You look as though you have seen a ghost." Wordlessly, Clara handed him the small bundle of letters, watching as his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to a slow, dawning fury as he read through the correspondence she had discovered. By the time he reached the final letter, his hands were trembling with barely controlled anger. "He wrote to her," Julian said quietly, his voice tight with restrained emotion. "For nearly 2 years, he wrote to Vivian, filling her mind with doubt about me, about our marriage, about my own family's history. I never knew. She never once mentioned these letters to me. Perhaps she did not wish to burden you with them," Clara said gently, "or perhaps she did not fully understand what Edmund was attempting until it was too late." Julian set the letters down carefully on the table beside him, his expression hardening into something Clara had not seen from him before, a cold, determined resolve that reminded her, briefly, of the reputation that had once frightened her so deeply. "He has been working against this family for years," Julian said. "First against Vivian, planting doubt and fear in her mind during what should have been the happiest years of her life. And now, it seems, he has turned his attention toward you, using your family's financial troubles as fresh material for whatever scheme he continues to pursue." "Do you think he had anything to do with her illness?" Clara asked carefully. Julian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying fire. "I do not believe illness can be caused by words alone, Clara. But I do believe that sustained fear and doubt can weaken a person's spirit, can make them more vulnerable to whatever misfortune finds them. Whether Edmund's letters played any direct role in Vivian's decline, I cannot say with certainty. But I know now that he has spent years working to undermine this family from within, and I will no longer allow him to continue unchecked." The following morning, Julian summoned his solicitor from the nearby town, a sharp, careful man named Nathaniel Wren, who had served the Ravenshallow estate for over a decade. Clara sat beside her husband as they laid out the letters and explained their suspicions regarding Edmund's activities, both past and present. Nathaniel listened carefully, examining the letters with a practiced eye. "This is troubling material, Your Grace," he said finally, "though I suspect there is more to uncover. If Mr. Ashford has indeed purchased or influenced your wife's family's outstanding debts, as his recent visit suggested, there should be a paper trail we can follow to confirm his involvement. How quickly can you investigate this matter?" Julian asked. "I can begin immediately," Nathaniel said, "though I would advise caution in confronting Mr. Ashford directly, until we have gathered sufficient evidence to expose the full extent of his activities. A man cornered too early may simply destroy the evidence we need, or worse, escalate his efforts before we are prepared to counter them." Clara felt a flicker of unease at the solicitor's warning, understanding the delicate balance they would need to strike between gathering proof and protecting themselves from whatever further schemes Edmund might attempt in the meantime. Over the following days, Nathaniel worked diligently, corresponding with contacts in Ashcombe and reviewing the financial records of the Bennett family's outstanding debts. Clara found herself increasingly anxious as the investigation progressed, aware that her own family's misfortune had inadvertently become a weapon in Edmund's ongoing campaign against Julian and the Ravenshallow name. "I should write to my father," Clara said one evening, as she and Julian reviewed the latest findings Nathaniel had sent. "He deserves to know that our family's troubles may have been deliberately engineered by someone seeking to harm us." "I agree," Julian said, "though we must be careful in how we approach this. If Edmund realizes we are actively investigating him, he may act more aggressively, or attempt to cover his tracks before we can gather sufficient proof." As the days passed, Nathaniel's investigation slowly began to reveal a clearer picture of Edmund's activities. He had indeed quietly purchased several of the outstanding debts owed by Clara's father, using an intermediary to obscure his involvement, likely intending to use this financial leverage to pressure the Bennett family, and by extension, Clara herself, into some future scheme that had not yet fully revealed itself. What could he possibly hope to gain? Clara asked one evening, frustration evident in her voice. The title has already passed to Julian. What purpose could all of this serve? Nathaniel, who had joined them for dinner to discuss his findings, exchanged a careful glance with Julian before answering. I believe, Your Grace, that Mr. Ashford may be attempting to manufacture grounds for a legal challenge to the marriage itself, perhaps hoping that if sufficient scandal or financial impropriety could be attached to your family, questions might be raised about the legitimacy of the union, potentially opening a path toward challenging the succession entirely. The full weight of Edmund's scheme settled over Clara like a heavy blanket, understanding now the true scope of what they were facing. This was not simply the bitterness of a disappointed relative, but a calculated, years-long campaign designed to eventually reclaim a title and inheritance Edmund believed had been unjustly denied to his branch of the family. Then we must ensure he fails, Clara said firmly, meeting Julian's eyes across the table. Whatever it takes. Julian reached across and took her hand in his expression resolute. Together, he said quietly, echoing the promise they had made to each other weeks before. We will not allow him to succeed. With Nathaniel's investigation continuing quietly in the background, Clara found that the weeks which followed brought her and Julian closer together than she had thought possible in such a short time. The shared purpose of uncovering Edmund's schemes seemed to strip away the last of the careful distance that had once existed between them, replacing it with an easy partnership that Clara treasured more than she had expected to. One afternoon, as they walked together through the small courtyard containing the cherry tree Julian had planted in Vivian's memory, Clara found herself sharing something she had not yet spoken aloud to anyone at Ravenshollow.
I was terrified before I came here, she admitted.
Not simply of the stories about you, though those frightened me greatly. I was terrified of failing my family, of being unable to provide the security they needed, of entering a marriage that offered no promise of genuine affection, only duty and obligation. Julian listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. I understand that fear more than you might realize. After Vivian's passing, I convinced myself that I would never again allow myself to hope for genuine happiness in marriage. I believed I would spend the remainder of my days fulfilling my duty to the estate and the title, nothing more. When your father's letter arrived, I nearly declined to pursue the arrangement at all. What changed your mind? Clara asked. A conversation with Mrs. Pemberton, in truth, Julian admitted, a small smile playing at his lips. She reminded me that Vivian would not have wished for me to spend the rest of my life alone, mourning a happiness that could not be reclaimed, rather than seeking new happiness elsewhere. It took me some time to accept the wisdom in her words, but eventually, I found myself willing to take the chance. Clara felt her heart warm at his words, understanding now the depth of vulnerability he had allowed himself in choosing to pursue their marriage, despite his own fears and grief. I am glad Mrs. Pemberton offered such wise counsel, she said softly. As am I, Julian agreed, reaching out to take her hand as they continued their walk through the quiet courtyard. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching, and they turned to find Grace hurrying toward them, a worried expression on her face. Your Grace, forgive the interruption, Grace said breathlessly, addressing Julian directly. A letter has arrived from Mr. Wren. He says it is most urgent and requests you review it immediately. Julian took the letter with a growing sense of unease, breaking the seal quickly and scanning its contents. Clara watched his expression darken as he read, his jaw tightening with barely controlled tension. What is it? She asked, unable to bear the suspense any longer. Nathaniel has uncovered further evidence, Julian said grimly. It appears Edmund has been in contact with a distant cousin of my mother's family, a man with some influence in matters of inheritance law, discussing the possibility of formally challenging the legitimacy of our marriage, on the grounds that I entered into it, while allegedly still suffering from what Edmund describes as a fragile state of mind, following Vivian's death. Clara felt a cold anger rise within her, at the audacity of the claim. He intends to argue that you were not of sound mind when we married? It would appear so, Julian said. A baseless claim, certainly, but one that could cause significant delay and scandal if pursued formally, particularly if Edmund manages to find sympathetic ears among certain members of the peerage who might benefit from seeing the succession thrown into question. We must act quickly then, Clara said firmly, before he has the opportunity to formalize whatever claim he intends to make. Julian nodded, already turning toward the house, his expression set with determination. Nathaniel suggests we may have found sufficient evidence now to confront Edmund directly, using the letters we discovered alongside proof of his purchase of your family's debts, to demonstrate a clear pattern of deliberate malice, rather than simple family concern. That evening, Julian sent word to Edmund, requesting his presence at Ravenshallow the following day, to discuss what the letter carefully described only as urgent family matters, requiring immediate attention. Clara spent the following hours helping Nathaniel organize the evidence they had gathered, arranging the letters chronologically alongside careful documentation of the debt purchases and the recent correspondence regarding the challenge to their marriage. "Are you frightened?" Julian asked her that night, as they prepared for what promised to be a difficult confrontation the following day. Clara considered the question carefully, remembering the first time he had asked her something similar, on their wedding night, when so much between them had still remained uncertain and unknown. "No," she said finally, echoing her answer from that night weeks ago. "I am not frightened of what tomorrow brings. I am ready to face Edmund alongside you, and I trust that together, we will ensure the truth finally comes to light." Julian looked at her with an expression of such genuine affection and gratitude that Clara felt her earlier anxieties melt away entirely. "I do not think I could face tomorrow without you beside me," he said quietly. "You have brought something back to this house that I feared had been lost forever." "And what is that?" Clara asked softly. "Hope," Julian said simply, "and the belief that happiness, genuine happiness, remains possible, even after great loss." They spent the remainder of the evening reviewing their strategy for the following day's confrontation, Clara growing increasingly confident that between the evidence they had gathered and their combined resolve, Edmund's schemes would finally be brought to an end. Yet as she finally settled into sleep that night, a small thread of unease remained, a quiet awareness that a man who had spent years carefully building toward this moment would not likely surrender his ambitions without a fight. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring the confrontation that had been building since her very first day at Ravenshallow, and whatever the outcome, she was determined to face it with the same courage that had carried her through every challenge since her arrival at this once frightening, now beloved house. But Edmund Ashford arrived at Ravenshallow the following afternoon, with the same confident smile he had worn at every previous visit, clearly unaware of what awaited him in the formal drawing room, where Julian, Clara, and Nathaniel Wren had gathered to receive him. "Cousin," he greeted Julian smoothly, taking a seat without waiting to be offered one. "Your letter mentioned urgent family matters. I confess, I am curious what could warrant such formality." "Sit down, Edmund," Julian said, his voice carrying a controlled steadiness that Clara had come to admire over the past weeks. "We have much to discuss." Nathaniel stepped forward, placing a neat stack of documents on the table between them. "Mr. Ashford, we have gathered considerable evidence regarding your activities over the past 3 years. Activities we believe demonstrate a clear and deliberate campaign against this family, beginning with your correspondence with the late Lady Vivian." Edmund's confident expression flickered for just a moment, a crack in his careful composure, before he recovered smoothly. "I do not know what you mean. My correspondence with Lady Vivian was nothing more than concerned family communication." Concerned family communication does not typically involve planting doubt about a husband's mental stability, nor does it usually include claims about supposed instability running through an entire bloodline, Julian said coldly, sliding the bundle of letters across the table. "We found these in Vivian's sitting room, Edmund. Every letter you sent her over nearly 2 years." For the first time since Clara had met him, Edmund's composure fully deserted him, his face paling as he stared at the familiar handwriting on the letters spread before him. "This is a private matter," he said finally, his voice tight. "Whatever concerns I raised with Vivian were between family members, nothing more." "And your recent purchase of my wife's family's outstanding debts?" Julian continued relentlessly. "Was that also simply concerned family communication, Edmund? Or perhaps your correspondence with a cousin of my mother's family, discussing the possibility of challenging the legitimacy of our marriage on grounds of my supposed instability?" Edmund's face had gone entirely white now. His earlier confidence collapsed entirely under the weight of the evidence laid before him. "You misunderstand my intentions entirely," he said, though his voice lacked its usual smooth conviction. "Then explain them to us clearly," Clara said, speaking for the first time since Edmund's arrival. Explain why you spent 2 years filling your cousin's late wife's mind with doubt and fear about her own marriage. Explain why you purchased my family's debts under a false intermediary, rather than approaching us directly, if your concerns were genuinely honorable. Explain why you sought legal counsel regarding a challenge to our marriage before we had even completed a full month as husband and wife. Edmund's eyes darted between Clara, Julian, and Nathaniel, clearly searching for some avenue of escape from the mounting evidence against him. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly, and something like genuine bitterness crept into his expression. "You have no idea what it is like," he said quietly, "to watch a title and inheritance that should rightfully belong to your family pass instead to a younger branch, simply because our grandfather held some petty grudge against my father that neither of us ever fully understood. I grew up watching Julian inherit everything I believed should have been mine, and when Vivian's illness gave me an opening, I confess I hoped that perhaps, through whatever means necessary, the succession might eventually find its way back to where it truly belonged." "You sought to profit from my grief," Julian said, his voice cold with barely restrained anger. "You attempted to undermine my marriage to Vivian while she still lived, and now you have attempted the same against my marriage to Clara, using her family's misfortune as a weapon." "What do you intend to do with this information?" Edmund asked, his voice tight, with something that sounded almost like fear now that the full weight of his exposure had settled over him. Nathaniel stepped forward, his expression carefully professional despite the tension in the room. "Given the evidence we have gathered, Mr. Ashford, His Grace would be entirely within his rights to pursue formal legal action against you, potentially resulting in significant financial penalty and lasting damage to your own reputation and standing within the family." Edmund's face had gone entirely gray now, the reality of his situation clearly settling over him. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "whatever satisfaction you might gain from ruining me entirely, consider that it would also bring further scandal upon the Ravenshallow name, precisely the outcome I understand you have spent considerable effort trying to avoid." Julian was quiet for a long moment, considering Edmund's words carefully. Clara watched her husband, understanding the difficult calculation he now faced, weighing justice against the potential further damage that a public scandal might bring upon the family name. "I have no interest in destroying you entirely, Edmund," Julian said finally. "Despite everything you have done, you remain family, however distant your loyalty has proven to be. But I will not allow you to continue these schemes unchecked. You will cease all further contact with Clara's family regarding their debts, which you will transfer back to their original holders at no additional cost. You will abandon whatever legal challenge you have begun pursuing regarding our marriage, and you will make no further attempt to spread falsehoods about my character, whether to family, staff, or the wider public." "And if I refuse?" Edmund asked, though his tone suggested he already understood there was little room for negotiation remaining to him. "Then Nathaniel will proceed with formal legal action, and I will ensure that every detail of your correspondence with Vivian, along with your recent schemes against my current marriage, becomes known throughout every social circle that matters to you," Julian said firmly. "The choice is entirely yours, Edmund, but I would advise you to consider carefully which outcome truly serves your own interests." Edmund sat in silence for a long moment, clearly weighing his limited options. Finally, with visible reluctance, he nodded slowly. "I will agree to your terms," he said quietly, "though I want it known that I do not consider this matter settled entirely fairly." "Fairness," Julian said coldly, "is not something you have shown much interest in these past 3 years, Edmund. I suggest you accept these terms and consider yourself fortunate that I am willing to extend even this much mercy." Edmund rose from his seat, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by a defeated, bitter expression that Clara almost found herself pitying, despite everything he had done. Without another word, he turned and departed the drawing room, and moments later, they heard the sound of his carriage pulling away from Ravenshallow, likely for the final time. Once the sound of the departing carriage had faded entirely, Clara felt the tension that had gripped her throughout the confrontation finally begin to ease. She turned to Julian, finding him watching her with an expression of quiet relief and gratitude. "It is finally over," she said softly. "Thanks to you," Julian replied, reaching out to take her hand. "Your courage in confronting him alongside me, your instincts in discovering those letters in the first place, all of it brought us to this moment. I do not believe I could have faced this alone, Clara. I am deeply grateful I did not have to." Nathaniel offered a respectful nod toward them both before gathering his documents. "I will ensure the debt transfers are properly completed within the week, Your Grace. I believe this matter can now be considered fully resolved." As Nathaniel departed, leaving Julian and Clara alone in the drawing room, Clara felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, the culmination of weeks of uncertainty and quiet investigation finally reaching its resolution. The rumors that had followed Julian for so long, the scheme that had threatened their marriage before it had even properly begun, all of it had finally been brought into the light and dealt with decisively. Julian pulled her gently into an embrace, and Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," Julian said, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head, "we finally have the chance to build the life we both deserve, free from the shadows that have hung over this house for far too long." Word of the resolution between Julian and Edmund traveled slowly through the surrounding villages over the following weeks, though not in the way Clara might have expected. Rather than a dramatic public scandal, the truth emerged gradually and quietly, carried through the same channels of gossip and rumor that had once painted Julian as a cruel and frightening figure. The baker's wife in Ashcombe, who had once warned Clara so directly about the dangers awaiting her at Ravenshallow, found herself instead sharing a very different story with her customers. One of a grieving duke, who had been unfairly maligned by a bitter relative, seeking to steal what was not rightfully his. The old servant, who had gripped Clara's wrist with such urgency before her departure, now spoke instead of the young duchess, who had bravely uncovered a years-long conspiracy and restored her husband's good name. Clara found a quiet satisfaction in watching the transformation of Julian's reputation, though she understood it mattered far less to her now than it once might have. She had come to know the true man behind the rumors, the patient landlord who forgave a struggling widow's rent, the gentle husband who tended his mother's roses and grieved his first wife with quiet dignity, the partner who had trusted her enough to share his deepest fears and vulnerabilities within days of their meeting. One afternoon, several weeks after Edmund's departure, Clara found herself once again in the small courtyard containing the cherry tree, now beginning to show the first signs of new growth as spring approached. Julian joined her there, carrying a small wrapped package that he presented to her, with an uncharacteristically nervous expression. "What is this?" Clara asked, curious. "Open it," Julian said simply. Inside the careful wrapping, Clara found a small portrait, beautifully rendered, depicting the two of them together in the very courtyard where they now stood, the cherry tree blooming softly in the background. "I commissioned it shortly after Edmund's departure," Julian explained. "I wanted something to mark this new chapter, something that honored both the past and the future, rather than simply erasing what came before. I hope you do not think it strange, wishing to include this particular setting." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes as she studied the careful artwork, understanding the significance of what Julian was offering her. "It is beautiful," she said softly, "and it is not strange at all. This tree represents your capacity for love and remembrance, Julian. I would never wish for you to forget Vivian, nor would I wish for our own love to exist in competition with the memory of what you shared with her. There is room enough in your heart for both, I think." Julian pulled her close, his expression filled with a quiet wonder that Clara had grown to treasure over these past months. "I did not expect to find such understanding, Clara. When your father's letter first arrived, I imagined, at best, a practical arrangement between two people making the most of difficult circumstances. I never imagined I would find someone who could understand and accept every part of who I am, including the grief I carry alongside the hope I have found with you. Perhaps that is simply what happens," Clara said, "when two people choose honesty over fear, even when the circumstances that bring them together seem uncertain at first." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through the branches of the cherry tree, casting soft shadows across the stone bench where they had first paused during that early morning walk so many weeks ago. "Do you remember the question I asked you on our wedding night?" Julian asked quietly. "I remember it well," Clara said, smiling. "You asked if I was frightened of you. And do you remember your answer?" "I told you I was not," Clara said, "and I meant it then, just as I mean it now, perhaps even more so, having come to know you so fully in the months since." Julian was quiet for a moment, his expression growing thoughtful. "I have thought often about that question, and about your answer," in the weeks since. I think, in truth, I was not only asking whether you feared me, but whether you might one day come to see past the rumors and the reputation, to find something worth staying for, something worth building a genuine life around." "I found far more than something worth staying for," Clara said softly. "I found a partner, a friend, and I dare say, a love I did not expect to discover so quickly, given the circumstances that first brought us together." "As did I," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "I spent 3 years believing genuine happiness was no longer possible for me, that grief and duty were the only companions I would ever know again. You proved that belief entirely wrong, Clara, and I am endlessly grateful that fate, or perhaps simply your father's timely letter, brought you into my life." As the sun began to set over the grounds of Ravenshallow, casting the old stone walls in warm golden light, Clara found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived at this house frightened, carrying with her every warning and rumor that the people of Ashcombe had offered about the cruel Duke awaiting her. She had found instead a man carrying grief with quiet dignity, patience with those who depended upon him, and a willingness to trust and be trusted that had surprised them both. The rumors that had once painted Julian as a monster had been revealed as the calculated work of a bitter relative seeking to reclaim what he believed had been unjustly denied to him. And in uncovering that truth together, Clara and Julian had built something far stronger than the practical arrangement either of them had initially expected. A genuine partnership founded on honesty, courage, and a willingness to face difficult truths side by side. That evening, as they sat together near the fire in their private chambers, much as they had on that very first wedding night, Julian turned to Clara with a soft, contented smile. He asked again, though this time the question carried none of the uncertainty or vulnerability it once had, only warmth and quiet affection. Clara laughed softly, leaning against her husband's shoulder.
"Never,"
she said. "I have never once, since that very first night, been frightened of you, Julian."
"I think, perhaps, I have only ever been grateful."
Outside, the wind moved gently through the branches of the cherry tree in the courtyard below, and inside the great house of Ravenshallow, warmth and laughter had finally returned, replacing years of shadow and quiet grief with the steady, enduring light of a love neither Clara nor Julian had expected to find, but which now promised to carry them both forward into whatever future awaited them together.